Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're talking with Robert Jensen, who, as the owner of the world's largest disaster management company, has spent most of his adult life responding to tragedy. From the Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, the Bali bombings, the 2004 South Asian tsunami, Hurricane Katrina to the 2010 Haitian earthquake and the Grenfell Tower fire, Jensen is at the practical level of international incidents, assisting with the recovery of bodies, identifying victims, and repatriating and returning their personal effects to the surviving family members. Robert is also author of Personal Effects: What Recovering the Dead Teaches Me About Caring for the Living. Later in the episode, I'll share how you can win a copy of this fascinating and thought-provoking book. Robert, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome.
You have a very unique profession. In fact, GQ called you the best at the worst job in the world. How did you come to do this kind of work, and what exactly do you do?
It is a different job, but it's an important job, much like I think the funeral directors industry, and it's caring for people. It wasn't a plan to fall into this line of work. I was a deputy sheriff in college and an Army officer, and when I was an Army officer, I went into what the Army calls mortuary affairs. It's a very specialized or small part of the active duty military. At that time, there was only one company-size element. And it happened, and my posting happened about the same time we were involved in some activities in Haiti. We had the Oklahoma City bombing. And so just by circumstance, I happened to have these mass fatality events happen when I was there in charge. And so I just kind of fell into it. And I kind of fit with a law enforcement background, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's no understatement to say that this is indeed difficult work. In the book, you say, the mission of disaster management is to recover the remains of the dead, despite the dangers and hardships to ourselves, and return the bodies to their loved ones for a dignified burial. Why is that important, and what motivates you to continue doing that?
Well, it's different for every family, and that's the challenge with a mass fatality. It's not a single loss where a system is set to help that one family. In a mass fatality, it's set up to have a system that's designed to be efficient because of the number of fatalities. That doesn't necessarily make it easy for the families. And for a lot of families, having a physical remains is the reality. Because when you have a loss and you have to deal with the deceased, you have to make decisions. And decisions for many people spark a sense of this is real because I'm really having to respond to this. I have to do something with my loved one. Now that I know I've made disposition of their remains, now I can maybe make disposition of their clothing in the closet, all the things that are in the house and that were part of the life together, the administrative things. So when we have a mass fatality, we have a huge system. And we may not always have a deceased because of the dynamics of the mass fatality. And it's the same for people who go missing as individuals. So there isn't that first step, which says the system is forcing me to deal with the deceased. So if the system isn't forcing me to deal with the deceased, then is it real? And if I clean out the closet, what happens when my loved one walks back in the door? Do they think that I gave up on them? Did I quit? Did I go on with life? And all of a sudden they walk back in? And while that does happen, it's extremely rare. And so for the families, it's a big step in the process, not for all families, but for the majority of people to have that choice to make that disposition and to start that, what I call a journey.
I would imagine it's extremely difficult for you to strike a balance between maintaining enough detachment to do your job without becoming completely desensitized to it, because you are dealing with loved ones who've lost their loved ones and they're grieving. How do you maintain that balance?
Well, and again, I think it's like anyone who's involved in as a first responder, law enforcement, or fire, medical, or the funeral industry, death care industry. I'm not there for me. It's not about me. I'm going to go home. You are there to help people who have a need, who don't have an ability to help themselves. It's not because they won't or they, don't know how. It's because it's not possible. It's not their skill set. And so that's your job, and that's what you signed up to do. So I don't think about me because it doesn't matter what I think or feel. I'm not the person who's affected.
In the book, you describe grief as one of the most powerful emotions on earth, yet few people talk about it openly or know how to deal with it. And you're dealing with grief pretty much on a daily basis and in large volume. And you said that you can detach yourself, but how do you deal with the grief that you might feel at times?
Well, I think grief is, as I did try to talk about in the book in a couple different places to I think, personal effects to try to reinforce the importance of understanding grief. Grief is powerful. The fear is a powerful emotion. The power of fear is probably stronger, I think, than the power of not fear or good. Again, grief is a response to something that we've seen that's hard, and we can either decide, well, can we fix it? If we can't fix it, then do we acknowledge it's occurred and look to how to prevent or how to make it easier? So we can't prevent things because we're humans, and humans are going to make mistakes, and Mother Nature's Mother Nature, and the earth is going to do the things it does, and we're going to make mistakes, and terrorists are going to do things. So we can't prevent them. So then instead of having a lot of incredible sorrow and sadness, and there is a lot of sadness and sorrow in the work, you instead focus on what is it I can do to make it easier next time for the people that are involved, the responders or the families. And so instead of focusing on the sadness and sorrow, and again, it's sadness because it's a human being. It's the pain and suffering. And for me, the worst part of the grief is going to a scene, knowing how hard it's going to be for the families, knowing it probably doesn't have to be that hard, but the system is going to make it harder, so that's a preventable sadness or sorrow. And then trying to make sure that we do everything we can to not make it worse. And I use the phrase in the book that the best we can do is zero. And by that I mean we can't uninjure somebody. You can't bring back the dead, at least no one I've ever met. And so the best you can do as a responder is not make it worse for the families. And that's where I see a lot of people make mistakes. And I don't think they make the mistakes intentionally, but whether it's a political decision or a practical decision by a responder or a person in charge or a person in a corporate office, we make it worse for the families. And that's what's hard. And families' first call isn't to a solicitor or a lawyer or the newspaper. Their first call is to the company involved. Their first call is to the people involved. And it's not to yell at you. It's to say, I don't know what's happened. And more importantly, I don't know what all of it means. So I need someone who can walk me through the expectations, who can be honest with me and tell me what to expect. And where you see mistakes in mass fatalities are people trying to make decisions for the families without asking their input, and more importantly, explaining the options they do have.
Losing a loved one in any circumstance is difficult, obviously. But when there's a sudden tragic circumstance like the ones you deal with, loved ones are desperate to not only recover the remains of their loved one, but it becomes so important to find their personal effects. Why is that so important?
Personal effects are really important. That's why it's kind of one of the reasons the book was titled that way. Because again, if we don't have the proof, if we don't have the casket, we don't have the headstone, we don't have the burial, has it really occurred? Use me, for example. I When I was very busy, I would fly a lot. Sometimes I'd do 250,000 miles a year. So me being on an airplane was normal. Well, my husband sits at home and he's doing his job or he's got some travel, and all of a sudden, I'm packed up, I'm going away on a trip, and I just don't come back. Well, you see on TV the plane, crashed, it went in the ocean, or that there was a train accident or earthquake or building collapse. You can see the pictures on TV, but still, is it real? Because Robert just packed his suitcase and left. He just hasn't come home, but, he's always delayed coming home. So the mind can be very difficult with the body and the emotion when it comes to acknowledging that. So having the personal belongings back, and having them back, not just back, but in a dignified way, and in a way that the families had the choice to participate in. The example I use in the book about the mother says, for 17 years, I washed my son's shirt. I don't want you to be the last person to wash his shirt. I want to wash his shirt. And it's about not just here's a plastic police evidence bag. Here's a jewelry case. Yes, this is a band of a watch, something somebody would walk over on the street. But it was recovered from a mass fatality. A family member recognizes it, and now it's presented to them in a jewelry box. And it's presented in a way they can choose to have a person bringing it, open it for them, and sit down and go through the process of recovery and how it came back. Or it's a person who says, here's the box, because they want to go put it in their closet and not open it for a month. It's talking to the family and then listening about the importance, because they don't want their loved one forgotten. And behind a lot of personal effects, there are stories. Oh, that's the favorite teddy bear. Here is the camera that was recovered from a crash site. And on the memory card or in the film, I'm old, so I still remember film, they're wedding pictures. Well, the wedding party didn't make it home, sadly. But the family can still look at the pictures, and the pictures will evoke the happy memories. For many, not for all, but for most.
So in many cases, those personal effects, when that's all that can be recovered, makes the death of their loved one real. And do you believe that begins or allows them to move on to the grieving process when quite often when you're stuck in that limbo, you can't move forward, but those effects allow you to?
For me, and so I describe it this way, and I think, of course, funeral directors are, experts at this because they deal with this, and sometimes on the same scale we do, because a lot of our people that respond are funeral directors, but obviously on a day-to-day basis. The way I describe it is there's a highway, and every day you drive down this highway. And all of a sudden, as you're driving down, the highway opens up into a big chasm, and you slam on the brakes, and so you stop. But your life continues on the other side of this chasm. So responders, our job is to have a plan and tools to build a bridge. And then you have to get on that bridge. The day you start getting on the bridge is the day you start making what I call a transition from what was normal, your old life, to your new life. You might also equate that with the path of going through grief, all the emotions that come with grief. And it is, I'm sure you know, some people won't get on the bridge unless they feel really confident, and then some won't make it across the bridge. And for most people, that journey in an average or an expected death can be about a year because we go through all the holidays. But in mass fatality, if we take a year and a half to be able to recover and return those personal effects, or to recover the deceased, and unfortunately this isn't like TV, these things take a long time, that journey can be even longer, because even though we go through a holiday, again, it's not real because the process, the beginning of the bridge isn't really finished. I can't move forward. So I think that having the personal effects, and more importantly, having an understanding of what's occurred in terms that mean something to the people involved, help that process. And that's why sitting down and talking to families and trying to answer their questions honestly is so important. And as I describe in the book, that's where, again, people make mistakes because, no one would want to know that, or I wouldn't want to know that. Well, it's not about you. So it is information that they may want to know.
What happens when you can't recover remains or personal belongings? How do you help a family accept the loss and grief at that point?
Well, you have to explain why you can't. You have to tell them everything that was done to try to accomplish it. And then you have to go through. And a great example of that is the miners at the Pike River mine in New Zealand. And it was several years ago, 29 miners, including one young man. It was his 18th birthday, was the day of the explosion. They let him start a day early. Were killed in a mine explosion. And the miners, now they have all their personal effects at home, but, the personal effects that they have on them are with them. And because of the multiple explosions in the mine, and this is in New Zealand, they were not able to recover the bodies. And they said it's either too difficult, too risky, too expensive. And so when the current prime minister, she was running for election as her first term, part of her party's campaign promise was to attempt to re-enter the mine. And they put a big program together to go in and say that they would try to re-enter the mine. So in February, and this was several years ago, the explosion or the disaster was in 2010. They just said this February that after the millions of dollars that they have spent, we've made entry, and they briefed the families. They have a police team. They said, we made entry, and we're going, but it's just too expensive or too dangerous, so we have to stop. And so, of course, the families are not accepting that because this was a whole this affected an election of a country's government. So the next thing the family said is, we still don't know what happened. And we think one of the ventilation fans is probably what sparked the explosion. We want you to recover the fan. And so the government or the agency, it's a semi-government agency that's running the recovery, said, no, we can't recover the fan. So now families have blocked the road and are protesting because you can't give me this, but I'd like something, and I'd like to be part of the discussion. So my point in this rather long answer, this is an event that happened in 2010. People went to work and didn't come home. And 11 years later, because it actually happened on the 19th of November, so we're almost coming up on the 11th year anniversary, it is still very hard for those families of the 29 because they went to work and they just haven't come home. And if they can't come home, then I want to know everything was done to tell me why and to tell me this isn't going to happen again.
Your book is titled Personal Effects, as you said, What Recovering the Dead Teaches Me About Caring for the Living. And in it you say, how we treat the dead reflects the way we treat the living. What have you learned about caring for the living from writing about this?
Well, it's I probably have learned more from doing it than writing about it, because it's just how I've lived most of my adult life, is being involved in these events. And it's that we tend to focus on all the bad in the world, and there is bad in the world. There's a lot of bad in the world. I have a in-law who was a policeman, and yesterday he went to domestic disturbance, which when I was a deputy I can remember going to. The difference is he got shot, and he's now in ICU because they're trying to save his life. And that's bad, and that's what people are going to remember, but they're going to forget all the good things he's done and all the other good people in the world because we'll focus on the bad. There's more good than bad, but because we see the bad and we reinforce the bad instead of trying to remember all the good that does happen. So what I hope people take away from the book is that, yes, life can be hard. There's lots of bad things, and there's a lot that we can't control, but there's a lot we can control. And that if we approach most people with a sense of good, more times than not, we're going to be returned with a sense of good. There will be the person that will take advantage and do wrong. But that doesn't mean the next person will do the same.
Who are you remembering today, Robert?
As in what?
As in a life, remembering a life. Who's on your mind? Who do you remember?
Oh, you don't want my memories. They're not memories I would wish upon anyone. There are all sorts of things. There's, October 31st was a day for several different aviation losses, including Egypt Air 990, which I responded to. We had Italy's worst air disaster on October 8th, 2001. There's Oklahoma. There's Haiti. There's all sorts of things. So I always remember probably more than I should. So there isn't just one.
Any one personal memory in your life apart from the disasters?
My life is probably not much different than many others. Well, I guess it is. It's probably different than most, which is probably a good thing that most people aren't have the same life. I try to remember the good things. I don't want to focus on the bad things because I can't do anything about them. They're done. So the past is the past. I can't undo or redo something and necessarily wouldn't want to. So what I look forward to is not remembering, but looking to the future. I don't want my yesterday to steal my tomorrow.
Good advice. Thank you for joining me today, Robert, and thank you for doing this very important work and for helping so many families not only acknowledge their losses, but also begin the very difficult grief journey in the midst of tragedy and finding the good that's in the bad.
You're welcome, Holly.
And to enter to win a copy of Robert's book, Personal Effects, visit rememberingalife.com/giveaways.